Hello, and welcome to our latest edition of Statehood Matters, the at-home edition. My name is Bo Schuff. I'm the executive director of DC Vote. While many Washingtonians are in the streets demanding justice for George Floyd and others killed by racism, many businesses and organizations like ours are still working remotely to keep folks safe and healthy in this time of global pandemic. Today, we are joined by one of the champions of democracy. Literally, we gave him an award last year that says so. He is our champion of democracy. Please welcome six-term Congressman from the 11th District of Virginia, Representative Gerry Conley.
Thanks so much, Bo.
Absolutely. Congressman, thanks for having us, or for joining us, I should say.
My honor.
I want to go back a little bit before we come forward to today, specifically to last September and the Oversight Committee hearing in the House, of which you're a member, there was a hearing on the statehood bill on H.R. 51. Much of the opposition that was presented about that bill on that day was about parking spaces and whether or not the Trump Hotel would be in the state or in the federal district. Were you surprised that most of the arguments that we heard against 700,000 people being fully represented were based on parking spots?
No, I'm not. And I'm going to sound partisan, but it's a reflection of reality, not partisanship. Republicans have gotten worse and worse on the subject, and they'll use any argument they can to try to discredit the right of over 700,000 fellow citizens to have voting representation in the United States Congress. And as I said at that hearing, when they say it's not about partisanship and it's not about race, you can be sure it's about partisanship and it's about race.
Yeah, that was a very important moment in that hearing was when one of your colleagues and one of the witnesses actually went in on that concept that it isn't about partisanship and it isn't about race. And you pushed back pretty strongly.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, there is no rational explanation for why in the 21st century, the United States of America, the world's greatest democracy, would deny all of the residents in a major urban metropolis their right to have voting representation in the Congress. It makes no sense at all, except through the lens of partisanship and race.
And at the hearing, it was sort of, there was some, the much concerned people were grumbling about the fact that it went to partisanship and race, except 2 weeks ago, the president said the quiet part out loud and flat out said to the New York Post that this is about partisanship. His exact quote was, very, very stupid Republicans would have to be in office in order for DC to get statehood. So much consternation about partisanship and race, at least the partisanship part, has been clarified by the president. You can't be surprised.
No, I'm not. And I think race in this case is inextricably linked with the partisanship. African Americans tend to be overwhelmingly Democratic. The city is largely African American. Therefore, Republicans have concluded they'll vote Democratic, and we don't want them to. And they refused to back up and say, well, this is about history. This is about a much longer, context. And it's not about how they might vote. We've never made that a criterion with other admissions.
Right.
Why are we doing it here? And that gets me to race, because they're Black, and we don't want them to be voting to reflect their political aspirations and values. And the Republicans have gone through contortions to try to rationalize that argument. So they should be, DC should be part of Maryland. Even though DC doesn't want to be part of Maryland. DC wants to stand on its own.
And Maryland doesn't have much interest in having us.
Yeah. They hide behind the Constitution. Well, remember, the Constitution was written before DC was created.
Right.
When we wrote the Constitution, we didn't know where the capital of the United States was going to be, and DC didn't exist. And the founders clearly did not see. They saw a relatively small administrative center that would meet periodically for government.
Right.
They didn't see a major urban metropolis layered on this federal center of government. And I think had they, the enlightened founders would have agreed they have a right to vote. They have a right to have voting representation in the Congress they create.
Right, and uh, I think that the issue of race is really sort of, as you sort of brought it into the conversation back in September, it's really come to a head in the last 48 hours here in the District of Columbia. We have seen thousands upon thousands of people protesting, a very diverse crowd, but significantly African American population in the crowd, obviously a majority person of color district. There's been small amounts of vandalism and looting, which occurs and is a byproduct of anger and frustration, but not large-scale rioting. Yet we have seen a full-scale occupation of DC by federal forces. More than 45 different law enforcement, multiple states have sent National Guard. The president has threatened or inquired about taking over the local police force. It just seems like race has really become a key indicator of oppression of the DC residents within the 48 hours in ways that we've not seen before. I mean, for lack of a better way to say it, what the hell is going on?
So I'm old enough to remember the 60s. And I remember Richard Nixon running as a law and order president and narrowly winning the 68 election. And when we had large civil unrest over the Vietnam War at Kent State and after the Cambodian invasion ordered by Richard Nixon, I remember the president, Richard Nixon, using similar language to Donald Trump to describe the protesters. And all that did was inflame the situation, and Nixon quickly beat a retreat. In fact, he actually met with protesters at the Lincoln Memorial one night. Not because he was a good guy, but because he realized he'd gone too far. For this president, there is no going too far. But what he doesn't understand is this is not 1968. The progress we've achieved, however inadequate, is real. Most Americans, white and black, are appalled at what happened to George Floyd and support protests. Right. And I was at a protest last night, sponsored by my local NAACP. It was a multiracial audience, several hundred people coming together to show solidarity, to express themselves peacefully, but to express themselves. They want to be heard. They want to exercise their First Amendment right. DC is no different. And it is very clear that this administration is attempting to exploit protests to elevate isolated incidents of vandalism and violence that have occurred, and in some cases to provoke it, as they did in front of St. John's Episcopal Church in a shameful episode of the use of lethal force to disperse a peaceful crowd protesting in front of that church, so that the president could walk from the White House and have a photo op with the Bible in this hand. It was a repugnant image. And what is interesting to me is it didn't work. Most Americans saw right through it. It was roundly condemned by religious officials, including the Episcopal bishop, including the Roman Catholic archbishop, including no less a conservative figure than Pat Robertson, a televangelist. So this is not 1968. The country's come a long way. We still have a long way to go, as the murder of George Floyd proves. But the residents of DC must not be subjected to military occupation and the use of the military to break up or prevent peaceful protests, which is the right of every American, including every citizen of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think that one piece that's unique, especially with the district, is, and that people don't necessarily know, is that the president has the ability to do a lot of these actions, and specifically to we saw a helicopter hovering lower than the top of an apartment building, a National Guard helicopter, and those actions are possible because of DC's lack of staging.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And one of my staff members has an apartment, and those helicopters came within a block of her apartment, and her windows rattled. She was quite concerned about what was going on, and it's obviously an overreaction, and it's a deliberate overreaction by this administration to make a statement. The problem for them is it is backfire. It's roundly condemned, even by some Republicans. It's not working. In fact, if the president looks at his own polling, his management of the civil unrest, let alone the economy and the pandemic, actually gets very low marks. It's in the 30 percentile. Most Americans want people to have the right to express themselves on the streets, in the cities, in their neighborhoods, without the interference of the United States military. And I would also say I'm proud of a lot of former U.S. military officers, including General Mathis, who have spoken out saying this is an inappropriate use of the military. You're pitting the military against the citizens they're sworn to protect. And it's absolutely to be condemned. It's not right. It's not American. And that's a proud moment for me as somebody who remembers the 1960s.
Where do we go from here? So Leader Hoyer, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer yesterday announced we'll see a floor vote on statehood this year, which we were a little concerned about with the compressed calendar. It's huge news, but what comes next overall? How do we move forward from this moment on statehood, but also just in general?
In an odd way, especially if we insist that that DC statehood is a discussion about race. We don't run away from that. We, in fact, embrace that. I believe that in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, there's a more receptive atmosphere to re-examining the issue of DC statehood in that context. And I think that could work favorably toward adoption of DC statehood. I'm a little concerned about putting it on the calendar for vote in Congress, in this Congress. We have a real reactionary leadership in the Republican majority Senate, which will never, ever accept statehood for DC, and they're in the majority.
In the Senate,
November may be a different situation, and we may have, and I pray we do have a much more receptive president in the White House after November. So we may want to look at next year as our opportunity, because the political environment, I believe, is going to shift pretty profoundly.
Fair. I appreciate that. Representative, thank you so much for being with us, for being a steadfast ally of statehood, for being one of our champions of democracy. I look forward to getting back to work with you when we can be in the same spaces, and I appreciate your time very much.
It's a matter of simple justice, Bo, and I will continue to fight for it. Thank you so much for your efforts, and I hope everybody watching stays safe and healthy.
Thanks a lot. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Bo.